What's up, you guys? Several months ago, I talked about my Rudolf family and how I had a suspicion that my fourth great grandfather may have been named Moses Rudolph. But at the time, I didn't really have any evidence to prove or refute this, and I'm very happy to say this is no longer the case because I just had something happen that doesn't happen very frequently anymore as someone who's been researching my family for over a decade, which is that I broke another brick wall in my family, and that's what I'm here to tell you about. You see, I knew from documents that my third great grandmother was named Anna Rudolph, and I had found a significant DNA match of my grandmother's which contained a large segment size. This match was descended from a man named Moses Rudolph, son of Solomon Rudolph, from Kalush, Ukraine. Now, the Kalush records only exist for a small number of years, and for a long time I was relegated to researching around the family rather than being able to access direct lineages for this branch. However, I managed to find a second DNA match of somebody else with the last name Rudolph, and for a very long time I couldn't figure out what branch of the family they were related from. I had sent out emails and didn't really receive anything substantial back, and so I put on my sleuthing hat and decided to do a deeper dive into this match, and I managed to figure out who they were descended from. Their ancestor was named Abraham Isaac Rudolph, who immigrated from a small village called Kuryipiv in the Ivano-Frankivsk region of Ukraine. Now, this was the same region of Ukraine that Kalush and a lot of my other Rudolph relatives were from. However, the specificity of the village of Kuryipiv allowed me to do a little more sleuthing. There were only a total of 4 records on JewishGen whose indexed translations referenced that village, but I was also able to find a few other references to the town on US ship manifests of other Rudolph relatives who came to America, and a picture began to unfold. As it turns out, Abraham Isaac had a brother, Kalman, who died back in Ukraine. However, his widow and children came to America, and one of those children lived with an aunt, Clara, or Chaya, who was yet another sibling. What piqued my interest was that Clara's ship manifest references her father being named Moses Rudolph, living back home in Ukraine. So despite not having any other references to Moses Rudolph besides from my first DNA match, here was yet another reference to that name on the second match. The real magic, however, came when I flipped through the few Kuryipiv references that were available on JewishGen, and the most notable of these was a birth record from Lviv, Ukraine. The 1903 birth of Solomia Regina Weitz doesn't list a father's name, but it gives the name of her mother, Yedi or Yetta. And the document says that Yetta's mother was named Golda Weitz, and references a man who appears to be Yetta's father as well, named Moses Rudolph, living in Kuryipiv. But the best part of the document is in the witness section. You see, the Sandik listed for the birth is Isaac Kohlberg, a baker living in Lviv. Isaac, or Issy Kohlberg, was my second great-grandfather, and he immigrated to the United States from Ukraine in 1905. And his ship manifest does say that the previous city of residence was Lviv. Up until this time, I had no idea whether he actually lived in Lviv because I didn't have any references to him in that city. But here we had a clear indication that this was him. It said he was a baker in the document, and we know that he was a baker by profession. And Issy's mother was Anna Rudolph. So here we had him in a document specifically referencing Moses Rudolph, who I had strongly believed to have been Anna's father. So this was clearly the biggest indication that Moses Rudolph was indeed Anna's father, but it doesn't even end there because there are so many additional details of the family I was able to uncover. I found another document in Ukraine, a 1919 death record for Mamsie Goldberg, daughter of Moses Rudolf and Golda, living in Kuryipiv. So there was yet another piece of evidence that Moses and Golda were a couple. I also plugged my known Rudolf DNA matches into DNA Painter's What Are the Odds, or WATO tool. And I know that it's not usually meant for endogamous genealogy, but that has not stopped me before. I still think that using it for endogamous populations can give you a decent overview of who you may or may not have been related to, especially if the matches are a bit on the bigger side, like the ones that I'm dealing with right here. And what it shows is that out of the 4 possible scenarios, the odds that Moses Rudolf was my 4th great-grandfather are about 20 times that of the 2nd and 3rd most likely hypotheses. Now, between utilizing records on Jewish Gen and immigration documents and things of that nature, I was able to estimate that Moses Rudolf had at least 8 children, all born from around the late 1850s to the late 1870s, though some of these children I am completely estimating their years of birth because there are no documents that reference their age whatsoever. So I'm going based upon the age of their children when their children were born. This is just an estimate. So what it makes me think is that Moses was probably born sometime in the 1840s, could have been a little bit earlier. Now, the thing that is the most confusing about this is that Moses is not one of the births that I was able to find in Kalush, and those documents range from the mid to early 1830s to the late 1840s. So I'm not sure whether or not Moses simply had a different name that he went by that could have been one of these other birth records, or if his birth document simply doesn't exist, or if he was born before the records exist, which would have put his date of birth sometime in the early 1830s or even the late 1820s. So I have no idea when Moses was born. There's a little bit of confusion as to when he died because he is referenced on a lot of ship manifests in like the 1910s, indicating that he was still alive for quite some time. However, one of his grandchildren is named Moses in 1903, which was very confusing. It's possible that there's just something that I'm missing on that specific branch. Could have been named after somebody else, but usually you don't see people being named after living individuals. So when Moses died, not really sure. The documents also indicate that he moved around quite a bit because he's referenced as living in Kuryipiv and Halich. And yes, these towns are all in the same region, but he seems to have been a merchant in that area. And so for right now, I don't know much about Moses himself, except the fact that it appears he had a good number of children, including my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Rudolf. So there you have it. This is my brick wall that I've smashed through on my Rudolf family. It's one that took years and years of building records and lists and diving into DNA matches and paying attention to the small towns that are listed on various documents. And because of the fact of this, it just goes to show that, sometimes the brick walls that you break through are not going to be overnight things. You're not just going to come across them from looking at a couple of individual records. You really need to look around the ancestor, compile as many sources as you can, because eventually it may all start to make sense. And that's what happened in this instance. Is I was researching my Rudolph family for years, reaching out to DNA matches, getting as much information from them as I could, paying attention to naming patterns, and then also figuring out that maybe I could start looking at the towns and seeing what other people lived in those villages that didn't even have the Rudolph surname listed on their records. And so thank you so much for sticking with me through this journey, and hopefully this is just the beginning. And there may be more brick walls to be broken through in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.